지금부터 미중 전략 경쟁과
Thank you very much. Now we are ready to start the session 1 under the theme of the U.S.-China power struggle, NATO's expansion, and the future of international order. For the session 1, Chung-in, chairman of Hankyoreh Foundation for Reunification and Culture, will serve as a moderator. And we have a keynote presentation. Professor Stein Tønnesson, research professor emeritus at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. And we have two discussants, Joon-hyung and Dr. Yinhong. And Professor Shi is connected via online. Since we have Zoom connections to Norway and China, we may have at some point some technical difficulties, so I'd like to ask for your understanding. I will hand over the microphone to Dr. Moon. Hello, everyone.
The conference.
Great to see you. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. 원래는 그렇습니다. 우리 스타인 테니슨.
Well, actually, the Professor Stein Tønnesson was planning to join in person, but unfortunately, he had some difficulty with his leg, health conditions, so he's joining us virtually. And Professor Shi, as you may can imagine, it's not easy to travel from China, so they are both joining via online. And for your information, Professor John Eikenberry was planning to join this symposium via online, but unfortunately, his father passed away recently, so he has a family funeral to prepare, so he couldn't join with us. But I will certainly take some time to deliver his message in consideration of the session 1. So once again, the topic for the session 1 is the U.S.-China power struggle and NATO's expansion and the future of international order. Before we begin,
Up to the first session, the introductory part of the session, then I will get into the English mode later. 스타인 테니슨 교수님은
well, let me briefly introduce Dr. Stein Tønnesson. Dr. Tønnesson is a research professor emeritus at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, associate editor for Asia in the Journal of Peace Research, and member of the editorial board of Global Asia. His areas of research are peace in East Asia, nation building in Southeast Asia, conflicts in the South China Sea, revolution and war in peace research. And actually, he is majored and specialized in the Southeast Asia. He is a really world-renowned expert, and we are really lucky to have him again for the symposium to share his insights. Once again, please give a big hand to Dr. Stein.
그리고 우리 신홍 교수님은 인민대학.
And Professor Yinhong is a professor at Renmin University. He's most famous international policy theorist in China. And he is a now counselor at the political...
And a position, and after the 10-year service.
You created it.
So.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for your correction.
My title now is only Professor International Relations, Renmin University.
Okay,
and the director of the Center for American Studies at the same university.
그러니까 제가.
So let me correct it. I was an advisor to the political committee, but he has retired after 10 years of service. Now he is only a professor at the Renmin University, and he is the chairman of the American Research Institute at the university.
그리고
And Professor Kim Joon-hyung of Handong University, I'm sure that you know him. And he was the chairman of the diplomatic graduate school of diplomacy in Korea. And he has been highlighted by the media with his theory, and he has his own views on the international affairs. So we will get a lot of insights from him. And Professor John Eikenberry, although he could not join us, he is a professor emeritus at Princeton University, and he has become famous with his view or theory of after victory, and he is the scholar with the knowledge on how the world has changed after the Second World War. And he's a liberal internationalist in the U.S. and he's the most famous liberal internationalist in the U.S. He could not join us today, but I have his discussion, so I'll read it.
Okay, first, Stein, you give us the 30-minute presentation with your PPT materials. And that will be followed by 5 to 7 minute presentation by Professor Yinhong and Professor Kim Joon-hyung. And also I will summarize John Eikenberry's discussion material, okay? And then we'll have about a 30-minute discussion among panelists. And that will be followed by questions and answer session with the flow. Okay, with this understanding, let me start with Stein Tønnesson. Stein, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I will proceed directly to my main message. The increasing rivalry between China and the United States threatens all of us, all nations, regardless of whether we are neutrals, partners, or allies of one or the other. All small and medium powers, all regional organizations should see it as a priority to contribute to turning around the downward spiral in Sino-US relations. An overriding challenge is to prevent the power struggle from undermining efforts to halt climate change and provide commercially viable technological solutions for green global growth. This requires an innovative combination of cooperation and healthy competition among companies and nations, not least between Chinese and US companies. That can only happen if peace is upheld, trade flows ensured, and investments can flow back and forth between the two great powers and the rest of us in a reasonably stable global order. I propose to you an inclusive we, encompassing all those of us who reject bipolarity. Asia benefited enormously from the rapprochement that took place 50 years ago between the United States and China. It paved the way for a long-lasting regional peace, allowing East Asia to eradicate poverty on a great scale and take over as the main center of global industrial growth. The Republic of Korea is right at the center of that happy story. A little more than 30 years ago, Europe benefited from the end of Soviet-US rivalry. It allowed the EU and NATO to expand and establish a new regional order encompassing West, Central, and parts of Eastern Europe. At one point, NATO set as its aim to develop a partnership for peace, meant to include Russia. This, alas, for many contested reasons and errors made on all sides, was not to be. Instead, Russia's leader from 1999, Vladimir Putin, would perceive NATO as a mortal threat. He developed an irredentist, strongly nationalist ideology aiming to re-establish as much as possible of the former Russo-Soviet Empire. This motivated Russia's brutal use of armed force in Chechnya, Georgia, and now Ukraine. It's essential to realize that NATO's expansion did not result from manipulative US agenda. If there was something that may be called a US empire in Europe, then it was an invited empire. In the same way that NATO was formed in 1949 by Western European nations inviting US protection, NATO's expansion from the 1990s was driven by a demand for national security among the former Soviet client states in Europe. The US allowed NATO's expansion to happen and saw it as an advantage to itself, probably, but Washington was not the driver of the process. A huge task for the coming post-Putin era is to lay the foundation for including all of Eastern Europe, also Russia, in a secure European order, and match it peacefully with a Central Asian order based on the Sino-Russian cooperation. NATO could, in my view, be inspired by the success of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has allowed the two great powers in Central Asia and the nations between and around them to cooperate peacefully, quite similar to what was thought about the the shared peace in Europe. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has done much to secure the long borders between China, Russia, and the Central Asian states, and remove some of the basis for irredentist attempts to rectify alleged injustices from the 19th century. Wise Russian leaders would show a similar concern for open and secure borders in the West. The idea of a partnership for peace in Eastern Europe might receive another chance once Russians decide to rebuild and diversify their economy and foreign relations and recover from the misery created by Putin's mismanagement, military gambles, and war crimes. It was a telling experience to see Putin being lectured by the leaders of China and India at the Shanghai Cooperation meeting in Samarkand in September about the need to avoid war and provide positive energy in a world in turmoil. Underlying the rivalry between the two great powers is an actual power shift from the US to China, which has accelerated in the first 2 decades of this century. China has grown its economy far more rapidly than the US. In terms of nominal GDP, it has bypassed all the world's nations, except so far the United States. China's GDP has reached a size that is around 3/4 of the US GDP, and if measured in purchasing parity power, the Chinese economy is already by far the largest in the world. However, GDP per capita and productivity remain lower than in the US and many other countries. The foundation of US global power is further strengthened by the NATO alliance and a set of bilateral alliances in the Asia-Pacific, notably with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. While the US has no reason to worry that China may match the US military strength anytime soon on the global level, it has more reason to fear that China may establish a regional hegemony in the Western Pacific. This would disrupt the US base and alliance system established in the aftermath of World War II. China has in the last couple of decades built formidable military forces with precision-guided land-based and sea-based missiles, a steady stream of new warships, submarines, fighter aircraft, and cyber capabilities. It also now produces its own aircraft carriers and modernizes its strategic nuclear missile forces. What China lacks so far is combat experience. The changes in the balance of force are perceived differently, of course, within the United States and Chinese politics. Americans and Chinese see China as a growing threat to what it sees as a liberal international order, built on two equally important foundations: the rights of states and the rights of humans, human rights. China sees itself as upholding international order based on the rights of states, but sees human rights as being utilized by the US as a means to intervene in the internal affairs of other states. China sees itself as being prevented from playing its stabilizing, beneficial role internationally by hostile surrounding powers. They are seen as determined to prevent China's historical rejuvenation. And I'm thinking here principally of the United States and Japan. Among the most important drivers of the US-China power struggle are internal developments in each polity. Over the last decade, US political leaders from left to right have adopted a vastly more hostile attitude to China than before. While the US Cold War presidents could count on bipartisan support in Congress for their foreign and security policies, mostly, a deep divide has developed in recent years between the Republicans and Democrats. This sometimes prevents the US from upholding sensible, predictive foreign policies. In the last decade, the Republicans and Democrats have competed in their quest to counter China's growing power. China huggers may still be found in academia and among US business executives operating on the Chinese market, or relying on China-based industries, but not in US politics. A key indicator of the failure of the US political system was the 2000 election of an unqualified, irascible president in the person of Donald Trump. He did his best to extricate the US from its multilateral commitments. Internal political developments in the People's Republic of China are not more reassuring. While in the era of Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, there was a culture of collective decision-making within the Chinese Communist Party, it has in the last decade concentrated power in the hands of one man, the 69-year-old Xi Jinping. By contrast to his predecessors, he does not seem to have done anything to enable his succession. Xi Jinping took full control of the 20th Party Congress and has obtained a mandate to complete a third term as leader of the party and the Chinese state. There is now a feeling that he will stay on as long as he can. He has vastly strengthened the role of the party, not only in the state and government, but also in China's business sector. He has subjected the Chinese society to an unprecedented degree of digital control. Ethnic minorities are systematically repressed for the purpose of assimilation. No dissent is tolerated. At the same time, Xi has failed to carry out reforms that are likely to be needed to keep up China's economic momentum. He has furthermore enforced extremely rigid policies to suppress the COVID-19 pandemic. These policies must be silently resented by many people in China itself, and they create fears of Chinese power abroad. In the foreign policy domain, Xi Jinping has shelved or perhaps forgotten the good neighbor policy that informed China's foreign relations in the first decade of this century, and replaced it with an assertive policy aimed at strengthening China's military power, reclaiming islands or reefs that were allegedly lost in the age of China's humiliation, imposing harsh security laws on Hong Kong, and threatening Taiwan's advanced democracy. Xi Jinping's ideology is purportedly Marxist, but in fact mainly nationalist. He and Putin share a dream of building a strong nations on the full territory of former empires. They also share the same threat perception of a US-led West that manipulatively sets up democratic opposition movements in Kiev, Hong Kong, and other places. Their historical narratives are key drivers of suspicion and hostility towards the US, Japan, and their allies. At the time of growing Sino-US rivalry, it is deeply worrisome that so many territorial disputes or flashpoints remain in East Asia. War could break out on the Korean Peninsula, as it did in 1950, with China and the US intervening once again on opposite sides. A confrontation might erupt more gradually in Myanmar, where I have spent much time, if its illegitimate but Russia-backed military regime is toppled by a US-supported and more legitimate national union government. The power is truly divided between the junta and the national union government in Myanmar today. China might feel compelled to intervene to protect its investments in mining, factories, and transportation. Then, in another place, a Sino-US naval battle could evolve from an incident in the South China Sea if China seeks to disrupt a US so-called freedom of navigation operation, or if China invades islands occupied by Taiwan, the Philippines, or Vietnam. A plausible scenario is one where China tests US resolve by invading the Taiwan-held Pratas Islands. They are strategically located near the main shipping lanes through the South China Sea. The most acute danger zone is probably the Taiwan Strait. Events during 2022 have increased the risk of a Sino-US war over Taiwan. In my opinion, China's national interests are best served by letting Taiwan gain independence, with full membership in the United Nations. China would be wise to do this voluntarily, out of its own realist volition. Until that happens, Taiwan will remain China's Achilles heel. The Chinese People's Congress adopted a law in 2005 that obliges the People's Republic of China to use force if Taiwan declares itself independent. The aim was, of course, to deter Taiwan from going independent. At the same time, however, the law obliges China to use force even in a situation where it might be defeated. This violates Sun Tzu's key principle of making sure of winning a battle before it begins. It is clear today that a huge majority of the Taiwanese do not want to be ruled from Beijing. If occupied, Taiwan could become a new Xinjiang, with hundreds of thousands of people in concentration camps. Let me add, since I realize that no Chinese leader anytime soon will dare to let Taiwan be independent, that the best for everyone is to preserve status quo. Preserve status quo. Status quo has allowed Taiwan to develop a strong economy, a state that respects the rule of law, and a vibrant democracy. It has also allowed huge Taiwanese investments in mainland China. Taiwan has not enjoyed membership in international organizations or been able to establish embassies in other countries, yet Taiwan's experience has proven that de jure independence and UN membership are not necessary prerequisites for national happiness. Taiwan is an inspiring democratic island in a world where other states other countries have become more and more authoritarian. This leads me to the irresponsible actions undertaken by the US and China this fall regarding Taiwan. First, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, made a high-profile visit to Taipei. She made the mistake of letting her sympathy for Taiwan's democracy affect her action in a matter of utmost strategic importance. This gave Xi Jinping an excuse for launching a totally disproportionate campaign to intimidate Taiwan, with missiles flying over the island and naval exercises being conducted all around it. Xi also suspended low and medium-level US-Chinese military to military talks on conflict prevention and bilateral cooperation on countering climate change. Now it was Joe Biden's turn. Predictably, he launched huge new sales of weapons to Taiwan and reiterated something he had said before in an interview with CBS on 19 September before leaving for Queen Elizabeth's funeral. He said that the US would defend Taiwan militarily if it came under, I quote, unprecedented attack, unquote. This was not, however, the most irresponsible statement he made that day. The worst was something he said twice in the same sentence. I quote, Taiwan makes their own judgments about their independence. We are not moving, we are not encouraging their being independent. We are not, that's their decision. I quote him precisely here because he mumbled, but he said that's their decision. Well knowing that the Taiwanese government and most of its people will want de jure independence, well knowing that this would lead to war with China, Biden stated that the Taiwanese themselves shall make the decision. This goes against established US policy as defined on the State Department's website. I quote, we oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, unquote. This wise policy has served the US, China, and Taiwan well. The US has been obliged by the 1979 Taiwan's Relations Act to maintain a capability for defending Taiwan, but not to actually do it if Taipei breaks with the One China policy and declares itself independent. This is called strategic ambiguity. What Biden said in the CBS interview was tantamount to telling President Tsai Ing-wen that if she or her successor after the 2024 Taiwan elections decides to hold a referendum on independence, then the US will defend Taiwan against the attack the Chinese government is bound by law to undertake. US allies around the world should make clear that they remain committed to the One China policy and do not support President Biden's view that Taiwan can unilaterally decide to be independent. And they should ask the White House to confirm that the president stands by the established US policy to, I quote, oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side and not support Taiwan independence. The US allies in Asia and Europe do not want to be drawn into a war over Taiwan. So just to summarize, I think China should let Taiwan go independent, but I don't think the United States should encourage it. Now I shall be very short. You Koreans know this better than me. But let me just say that the one thing President Trump did that I appreciated was his attempt to cut the Korean Gordian knot by meeting Kim Jong-un. The Kim regime is now more isolated than ever, mainly because of its own decisions. It once again draws attention to itself by firing lots of missiles, some of which pass, or at least one of which has passed over northern Japan. And it may be preparing for yet another nuclear test. I see no way to obtain the dismantling of North Korea's nuclear weapons or a long-term moratorium on any testing or further production of bombs, except through direct negotiations between the US and the DPRK president. So then, what is to be done? First, give priority to green growth. The main reason why East Asia became so peaceful from the 1980s onward was the priority given by the region's national leaders to economic development. When development holds top priority, it comes naturally to refrain from armed conflict simply because it's so costly and destructive. When concerns for security or for rectifying past humiliation takes over in the minds of national leaders, the danger alarms sound. I find some consolation in the fact that development is the word that Xi Jinping uses most often. The priority needed in the world today is one that combines economic growth and poverty reduction with policies to halt climate change. We see currently how the war in Ukraine has taken Russia out of the global effort to stop climate change. Environmental rules and regulations have been suspended in wartime, and the risk of methane gas leaks has increased. We've also seen China suspend the confident cooperation obtained by China's climate change envoy Xi Jinping and his US counterpart John Kerry, which led to a constructive, really inspiring joint statement at the summit in Glasgow last year. There is now an acute risk that China and the US will have nothing to present together at the coming summit in Egypt. Then there is a need to protect the integrated global economy, which in the event of war could be split into separate blocks. Decoupling. So far, we can sigh with relief that despite all talk, trade war and decoupling, the global flows of trade and finance have continued. China, Japan, the US, and EU trade with each other just as before and invest in each other's economies. The COVID-19 pandemic has done more damage to international production chains than the Sino-US power struggle. The value of US exports to China reached an all-time high in 2021 with 151 billion USD and is on a course to an even higher level in 2022. China's exports to the US were worth $505 billion in 2021. While this did not beat the record set in 2017 to 18, it was higher than in all other previous years. And so far in 2022, China's exports to the US have increased significantly relative to 2021. The tariffs established by Trump, which Biden has so far preserved, do not seem to have had any noticeable impact on overall trade. Both the pandemic and the trade war, so-called trade war, however, have taught us that nations cannot rely uniquely on market forces, but must keep reserves of essential products, diversify supply chains, and avoid total dependence on trade with potential adversaries. What can small and medium powers do? That's my last question. In East Asia, I think the nations that most fear Sino-US confrontation should cooperate in their attempts to dampen the rivalry between the two great powers, maintain status quo in the Taiwan Strait, protect an open global economy, and give top priority to fighting climate change. In Southeast Asia, the main candidates for driving such efforts are perhaps Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. In Northeast Asia, the Republic of Korea and Japan should coordinate their policies. The most uplifting aspect I see in the new ROK president's policies is his willingness to depoliticize history struggles and cooperate with Japan. This cooperation must not, however, lead to support for ill-considered US policies. Japan and the Republic of Korea should persuade the US to respect its past engagements, including the One China principle and the call for maintaining status quo until peaceful change becomes possible. Thank you very much.
Stein, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It's a very methodical presentation. Now, let me invite Professor Yinhong to make a comment. Please, Yinhong.
Okay. And can you let me to have, okay. And it's my great chance to be here to discuss with distinguished scholars and other people, and for which I would like to pay my deep gratitude to all the organizers of this significant discussion. And I would like to focus on Indo-Pacific Coalition and 4 former members, but increasingly expanding and in a flexible way. So I would like to title my presentation as Indo-Pacific Coalition, increasingly dynamic, flexible, and potent. And the first part, the previously, as to strategic military, besides its own armed forces in the United States, rely on several individual bilateral military alliances between itself and its allies in a very broad region now called Indo-Pacific, and assisted by a few underdeveloped bilateral military partnerships. Such a framework had its strategic drawbacks, relative narrowness in its geographical coverage, the lower degree of coordination among areas covered, and the singleness and the lack of institutional arrangement between or among its allies in the region. While there was benefit, the benefit of such a framework was at large only that the strategic affairs of the alliances were mostly decided by Washington alone, therefore relatively simpler and quicker. As you all know, in recent years, to deal with the drastic military buildup of China and rapid expansion of the extent of China's strategic activity, the United States and its critical allies, first of all Japan and Australia, have made major adjustments in the structure of alliances and coalition to strive for substantially mitigating the above drawbacks, or even gradually eliminating them. The cost of doing so, of course, is to make policymaking multilateral in a large extent, resulting in more troubles and relative slowness in this respect. As a coalition with remarkably less military integration than alliance, Quad has much broader geographical coverage, while the military cooperations among its member states can be much denser. Quad could be said as creating such a framework for war preparation against China that is led by the United States, but multidimensional and flexible to be expansible. Part 2. Besides the recently May 24th launched Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, which is the first military collaboration project joined by all 4 Quad members. The framework mentioned above consists of the following 2 major aspects. The first, military bilateral or trilateral cooperation against China among the 4 members of Quad, which are becoming increasingly prominent, wide, and concrete. The aggregated military cooperation between the United States and Japan constitutes Quad's primary beam as it were, besides the American Indo-Pacific forces. But Japan and Australia are quite actively setting up its auxiliary beam, the Japan-Australian military cooperation. Second, Quad has expanded itself in military flexibility by a quick speed with effectiveness, aiming at directly or indirectly, including Britain, which is particularly important in its role, and together with major EU powers and a NATO connection. The South Korean Yoon administration's participation in condemning China in its behavior in Western Pacific has come so rapidly. Defense chiefs from ROK, Japan, and the United States on June 11th in a joint statement highlighted the importance of peace and stability in Taiwan Strait. And they are, quote, strong opposition to any unilateral actions that seek to alter the status quo and increase tension in the Indo-Pacific, veiled criticism of China. Similarly, Russia's war in Europe and Pyongyang's taking power in ROK have launched a strategic connection for the first time between NATO and the Quad's flexible regional expansion framework. That means ROK, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand held a summit on the fringes of NATO summiting majority in the last week of June. It is seen by the four nations as an attempt to keep assertive China in check in Indo-Pacific after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, hidden the concerns about the implication for the region where Beijing has been expanding its influence, as the Western media rightly observed. Third, beyond the strategic high-tech collaboration agreement between the United States and Japan in Quad framework, Quad expansion has been aided a dimension of economy and technology. Remarkably strategic and quite flexible to be expandable, since Republic of Korea partially joined in Quad in early summer of last year. In later May this year, President Biden launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, whose design functions include remarkably boosting the alignment of supply chains, particularly relating to national security and economic and technological advancement, thereby squeeze further China's space of strategic and economic operations. Economic security alliance just became a keyword invented by Pyongyang, with economic increasingly become a servant of strategy. It's most worthy to note that the overwhelming majority of ASEAN countries have joined IPEF, though ranking into its realignment of supply chain is optional and boosted by the polarization of the world political economy. Perhaps IPEF's the prospect over time shall not be underestimated. First, on Beijing's part, the Global Security Initiative is at a rhetoric level. Nothing essential included is new, but only repeated of what China has advocated since later President John and Hu, with difference mainly in much polarized, therefore more difficult situation and in China's own behavior. The basic fact is that all great powers is doing, and I believe will continue to do things incompatible with GSI. China's arms have forced everyone's limelight. First of all, on the hotspot Taiwan. The present situation over Taiwan are marked by two developments in opposite directions. On one hand, both sides, the United States and China, keep their respective high prudence in the severe confrontation. But on the other hand, while China's military often holds the liquefied drills in the straits and the surrounding seas, this time it encircles Taiwan and targets areas within its territory, sea, and airspace. It also goes remarkably beyond the medium line of strait, which it has not done before. Moreover, the proximity of China's arms and live fires to some major ports of Taiwan with orders for all aircraft and vessels to steer clear of the geo areas amounts to a blockade in untested and even temporary. China's escalating military confrontation with the United States and its major Indo-Pacific allies will surely be aggravated even further in the long term through strategic interactions. Confrontation will go to a high gear while conflict is still unlikely. Even China's suspension of military communications have made the prevention of incidental clash somewhat more difficult, especially because of the hotspot Taiwan, as well as other spots in the region. What Indo-Pacific Coalition is capitalized in the title of this presentation should be changed, therefore, as increasingly dynamic, flexible, potent, and dangerous. Thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Now let us turn to Professor Joon-hyung Kim.
네, 안녕하십니까. 네,
Good morning.
저는 한국말로 하겠습니다.
Let me speak in Korean. Well, I believe we have excellent interpreters for the symposium, so I think it's okay for me to speak in Korean. Well, first of all, it's my great honor to join this symposium, sharing insights and learning from the world-renowned experts. Well, I really appreciate it and found very interesting the presentation, keynote presentation, and the ideas from Professor Shi. I have a bit of a different opinion, so let me share what I think about the current situation and on the topic for the session 1. Well, for the last 3 years, we call the period, post-Cold Era. 30 years, it's for one generation to come into the scene and then to move back to the stage. Now we have this serious conflict between, triggered by Russia, and I believe there is still really active signs which can trigger a new Cold War. Well, there are different terms used, Vox America and rule-based international orders, and there are different terms to refer to the current situation and developments, like global governance and integration, and the atmosphere for cooperation. Yes, that's all true in the past, but the rapidly changing developments around the world somewhat make us feel that, well, the past 30 years were really good time for us, but I believe we should not be fooled. So-called a new Cold War era may have, a lot of, difficulties and downsides as well, and really, dark clouds casted over our future. Yes, in Europe, in the past, they were really eager to integrate the continent, but now, it's almost like, fragmented world. Each country would like to pursue their own future to actually be self-sufficient. The nationalism, strong reliance, and a lot of geopolitical tensions are actually driving these trends. But what's important, I believe, is that we need to learn from the previous world order, and we need to actually devise solutions and have a clear direction to move forward. We are now living in the world of confusion. Yes, it is also true that only the downsides are highlighted. Yes, now we are heading toward so-called multipolar world or world order. Obviously, it's not in line with harmonization we have pursued so far. So I am quite worried because this multipolarization is intensifying. Yes, there is a strategic competition or struggle between the superpowers, and it is also worrisome that this impacts also the Korean Peninsula. Yes, China is strongly pursuing its, the Road and Belt Initiative, and the U.S. is, doing everything, almost everything they can to, have China in check and contain their, rising influence across the world. And this, continued provocation and show force of China in the, South China Sea and Taiwan Strait and surrounding regions. And all these are also impacting or bringing negative or adverse effects to the Korean Peninsula and surrounding areas as well. Yes, back in the Trump era, it was almost barbaric and really rough policies. But to some extent, the current President of the United States, Biden, is also on the same page. Maybe on the surface, he may look much smoother and more democratic, but I don't think that's all that America first, this selfish nationalism of the America is still in play. And also there's possibility some people talk about militarization of the Korean Peninsula, meaning both Koreas are beefing up their military force. So not only having discourse or communications, it's already really heightened the tension in terms of a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But again, U.S. is pushing its allies to restructure global supply chains. This is also its part of effort to contain rising power of China, taking their enlarging their share of pies, and so-called BBC bio battery and semiconductors. In those sectors, what the U.S. wants from Korea is that using a new or restructure the supply chain and help U.S. build their own, domestic industries. So it's quite ironic because U.S. was in the forefront establishing the, free trade order, and this is strongly or strictly going against the, principles of WTO. So still they think they are upholding, liberalism and democratic, market economy, but I do not believe that U.S. has the capability to trigger or usher in a new Cold Era. Roughly 25% of, U.S. is no longer taking more than 25% of the world GDP. China is fastly growing, and there are other emerging countries. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine, yes, there are a lot of difficulties, but there are India, Russia, and so-called BRICS nations are still, putting their efforts together. So all these are blocking U.S.'s efforts to actually take back their hegemony. So as Dr. Tønnesson mentioned, in 2022, we had a lot of incidents around the world. If you look at the numbers of the trade, between the two countries, they are having this really intensifying, power struggle, but still they are having this really inseparable trade relations between the two countries. So almost $400 billion of trade deficit with the trade with China. So I don't think whether it's really possible to have the full decoupling between the U.S. and China. So it's really complicated. So if U.S. forces to do that, artificially, I think it will certainly have a devastating effect around the world as well, not just between the two countries. So U.S. also have a strategic, interest on the Korean Peninsula. One is, quote, so what U.S. wants is to have, a stronger grip on the Korean Peninsula and, more broadly on the, Pacific area, Indo-Pacific area. It was already highlighted by, the discussant, Professor Shi as well. So let me, to present a couple of, suggestions, where we should go. So yes, now we are talking about a new Cold War, but there are a lot of, flexible, variables. It can be, better than before. It can be worse than before. But I believe there are three scenarios that cannot be materialized in the next 30 years. One is that U.S. cannot be fully contain China. And two, China cannot, outpace U.S., indefinitely. And the struggle between U.S. and China will be a kind of a war of attrition in the long-term perspectives. So that is the reason why we cannot jump to a conclusion picking one side. No. Just picking one side will make us more uncomfortable and put us in a more difficult situation. So we shouldn't limit ourselves or contain our capabilities within this geopolitical, framework. So yes, we have this, extended or enlarged joint military drills with the U.S. and even involving Japan. But it's not just, military, front. We have economic and social geopolitical influences or impact as well. So yes, value diplomacy is important, but how it is utilized recently is that it's just excluding other countries that do not serve our own interest or one's interest. So this shouldn't be the way we pursue. Rather, ethically good countries or bad countries, morally good countries or bad countries. All these are just, diplomatic rhetorics. Those are not concepts that we can rely on. Because, it's really subjective, concept or definition by each country. Korea should definitely pursue, not swayed by these geopolitical influences. We should focus on building peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula and in the Pacific region in a larger context. So, in our diplomacy, peace should be our top priority. Yes, we need to have negotiations. We should not isolate ourselves or contain ourselves to one side or limited bloc. Yes, even if every country around the world want to live by themselves or be fully self-sufficient, but that's not possible. And there are countries who can help us and for whom we can provide our assistance. So I believe maybe this is time for Korea to take the lead in actually promoting dialogue and discussions on peace. This is where I fully agree with Professor Tønnesson. Rather than picking sides, we should focus on solidarity. As mentioned by the keynote presenter, yes, SCO, India clearly pointed out that, to the Putin, you should stop the war. It was really, very kind of shocking to me. It happened in those, international arena. So this is, this happened within the same bloc. So if we do not have enough, power as a country, we have EU, Australia, and ASEAN countries. Maybe we can establish a so-called third bloc, third zone, or a buffer zone, so that we can actually alleviate or reduce the tensions or conflict between U.S. and China. And we have other, players in the, South America. They are not fully participating in the world economy. Maybe we can actually look for ways to collaborate them or form solidarity with them. So there are three phases: conflict, competition, and confrontation. 3 C's. So among them, cooperation can be divided into 3. For climate change, to respond to pandemic, and for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So these 3 areas are now not making much progress due to the conflict, ongoing struggle between the U.S. and China. So if this situation worsens, as Dr. Tønnesson mentioned, this is really pressing. The most pressing, challenge for all of us, humankind, is climate change. We cannot afford to lose more time. Thank you very much.
감사합니다. 아주 명쾌하고.
Thank you. That was a very clear and penetrating analysis. We will open the floor in a while. And if you have any question, please write the question down and pass the paper to our staff. So please ask your questions in writing. And Professor Eikenberry could not be with us today, so I'll just read his summary. What he said is that with the Trump administration, the liberalist world order has been disrupted, and the Trump withdrew from the party convention and other conventions, and with the Biden administration, the U.S. Came back to the the Paris Convention and the WHO. As such, the Biden administration pursues multilateralism and seeks to restore America's hegemony. That's what he says. But the biggest stumbling block to this effort is its conflict with China. And it can be said in 3 C's. There are 3 areas of cooperation: climate change and pandemic, and the stopping weapons of mass destruction. But in the matter of values like human rights and the geopolitical issues, it will not avoid its conflict or confronting China. So the U.S. will have to work with partners and allies to form a larger or wider coalition with the liberalism to respond to China's expansion. And Professor Hankyoreh said the overall atmosphere is that the U.S. will have to try to avoid conflict with China. I think his idea is almost the same as Professor Kim's idea. And there are some points that are similar to or different from Professor Tønnesson's idea.
And Stein, you have been very close observer of Ukrainian war. What is your assessment of future prospect of Ukrainian war? Is there any chance of escalation into nuclear confrontation? Because these days now, Ukraine as well as Russia are talking about dirty bombs. Dirty bombs is a kind of quasi form of nuclear bombs. Okay, therefore we are very much concerned about that kinds of development. Moreover, for example, in the United States, liberal coalition, particularly among the Democratic Party members, they are arguing that there got to be democratic solution, that diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian issue. In other words, there seems to be some kind of war fatigue in the U.S. and in Europe. What is your take on all those overall development in Ukraine?
This is the big unknown factor when it comes to the whole global power play, what is going to happen to Russia and Ukraine. I see that the most surprising developments of the last few months is that the Russian performance is so extremely miserable. The conditions within the Russian armed forces are really at a very low point, with low morale and with also spending the weapons so that they don't have modern weapons to supply. So I see militarily two likely scenarios. One is that the battlefront simply will be stalemated for the winter, and there will be, I don't think Russia has the capacity to launch any large-scale offensive. The other possibility is that you simply have an erosion or total loss of morality on the Russian side, and with internal infighting on the Russian side, and the Ukrainian victory, because the Ukrainian performance in the conflict has been truly impressive, with a high morale and also with the flow of weapons from other countries into Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have been able to learn how to use them very quickly. Now there is a fight against drones. Russia bought drones from Iran, but the Ukrainians are learning how to shoot them down. So these are my two scenarios. One is a stalemate, and the other one is a Ukrainian victory. and that could have unforeseen consequences in Russia. I have some difficulty in a way understanding how these various scenarios could play out globally, because for the United States, China is definitely the main threat. And to concentrate its effort on Russia is a detour. On the other hand, the Americans also think that a defeat for Russia may be a kind of lesson for China, that China will see that something similarly disastrous could happen if China were to occupy or invade or attack Taiwan. But on the other hand, the United States European allies in NATO are now getting totally absorbed by the situation in Europe, where the struggle is to prepare for a cold winter, where you may also see some European governments of the more extreme right having sympathies for Russia and being unwilling to join in the kind of economic struggle that the whole of Europe is involved in. And if that happens, then NATO's new interest in China, which was mainly motivated by the need to keep the United States committed to Europe, that will lose importance because Europe becomes consumed by Russia. Then perhaps you may see now a situation where NATO will be Europeanized. And the US willingness to take part in all the problems of Europe will diminish, and NATO becomes a truly European organization, where with a lot of armaments now in the various European countries, we are spending more and more on arms now, of course. And then on the other hand, you have the developments that Yinhong described very precisely about the alliance building in East Asia, where the United States no longer can just play the various bilateral allies, but needs to the Asian allies to take more responsibility, and therefore also tries to build more cooperation. And that gives Japan and South Korea and Australia a stronger role in this, and as Yinhong said, complicates decision-making. It's a very complex international game, and where if the scenario of a Russian implosion occurs, then we really don't know what's going to happen. And there might be trouble in Central Asia as well.
But Stein, you don't see any chance of an escalation into some kinds of a nuclear war in Ukraine? That is our primary concern.
We had a big discussion here in Oslo about that yesterday at a meeting, where we went through all the threats that Russia has come forward with. They seem to be bluffs. One of the threats said that Russia will use all means at its disposal if Russian territory comes under attack. But then Russia had then just annexed the eastern parts of Ukraine, where attacks are already ongoing. So that means that Russia is obliged through that statement to already now have used nuclear weapons. So it doesn't make sense. The threats that have come forward are vague or, when precise, unrealistic. And we have not seen any concrete measures being undertaken on the ground. If Russia wants to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, they would have to move them out of their storages. And if they move the tactical bombs out of their storages, that will be observed by intelligence. This has not happened. We will see what happens now during the annual exercise, which has not started yet, for the strategic weapons in Russia. And that's, of course, followed But also, it doesn't make sense to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It would harm Russia's own forces. You don't have you can use tactical weapons if you are attacked by a huge army, concentrated huge army. Then you can destroy it with a tactical nuclear weapon. But you can not use tactical nuclear weapons against scattered, smaller groups that attack you from various directions. And also psychologically, for Russia itself to use nuclear weapons against a people whom Putin claims to be Russian. It doesn't, and so the alternative, of course, to use strategic weapons, that's insane. And we don't think that Putin is insane. I agree with President Biden that he is rational. So I'm not really, I don't really believe much in the nuclear scenario.
I hope so. Professor Yinhong, what is your take on Ukrainian situation?
If you look at the so-called third campaign and from the end of August, and I think that especially in the early and the middle and even in the later September, and there was a very clear and a strategic initiative on the part of Ukraine armed forces. And they also have quite, you can say, the offensive mobility. But after that, in the past 3 or 4 weeks, I think that there had been a clear reduction of strategic initiative and offensive mobility on the part of Ukraine armed forces. And except for and still quite intensive offensive against Kherson, generally, whole of the fight front has become something just like a lower intensity and stalemate. And this means that I guess the President Zelensky have some worry that if offensive on the Ukraine part are still very intensive, Putin will do some desperate action against Kiev, against other parts which and previously still and kept its defensive calms. And also, I think that the manpower has near to exhausted on the Ukraine part, and high spirit and cannot replace anything. And also, I think that the United States and NATO, although still keep in their own domestic economic difficulties, keep quite a strong support the approach and to Ukraine resistance. But they have a very strict limitation on their own behavior that they don't want and Putin to be forced into a desperate situation and then take a very dangerous escalation of war itself. So I think that the winter is nearing to come, and the Russian is and disadvantages in the battlefield, but the things the strategic superiority on the part of Ukraine and the things and toward the end of August has remarkably reduced. So it will be stalemate.
Stalemate. Okay, now Professor Kim, no, let us forget about Ukraine. Let me ask this question. You argue that if you look at the overall power configuration, okay, United States account for 25% of global GDP, while China accounts for 20% of GDP. If you look at that kind of power configuration, it is totally inconceivable to expect the advent of a new Cold War, okay? But it's just the power configuration is the only determinant of a new Cold War? And how would you define the new Cold War?
예, 저는
Well, when we talk about new Cold War, the term itself It originated from Cold War, of course, but the Cold War we know is between the U.S. and Soviet Union. But that one is exclusively, set the two separate blocks. But on the other hand, a new Cold War, it's way more messy. That's what I envision. There are different values involved, the different blocks, several blocks, not just two. A lot of geopolitical, interests all intertwined. So it's almost like, you have this thick book and you are trying to tear it apart. So in the past, previous Cold War, it's just, this one or that one. But now a new Cold War is not that.
Talked about the so-called value issues, and as an important, barrier for, China-U.S., cooperation. But I see, some interesting pattern. John Eikenberry argued that we can cooperate in climate change, pandemic, and proliferation of, weapons of mass destruction, etc. But at the same time, United States pounding on violation of human rights in Xinjiang and democracy in Hong Kong and Taiwan and etc. But China would consider those kinds of things internal matters and also matters belonging to, territoriality and sovereignty of China. While the U.S. touching on or pressing core values of China, can the U.S. expect to have a cooperation in other areas?
If I can take the floor?
Mm-hmm.
My answer is yes. That I think it's possible to criticize human rights abuse in other countries and still cooperate economically, technologically, and so on. But you must compartmentalize it. And I think one proof of this is that the climate change talks between China and the United States have continued and been productive even at a time with very great difficulties in other areas. The Cold War was a war between two parties that had little economic interaction at all. This is not something that can happen between the United States and China. I think it's impossible to decouple the economies because the costs will be so enormous to both sides unless you have war. If China attacks Taiwan, then there will be a decoupling. And we've seen an example of such decoupling now with Russia, because Russia invaded Ukraine, and that has led to an extremely harsh and tough decoupling. We have it even here in Norway, where fishing boats from Russia can no longer land the fish that they normally land in Norwegian ports. The pressure to decouple from Russia is so strong when there is wartime. So decoupling is linked to war, and then if there is war, it's not a Cold War, but a hot war.
But I think there's oversimplification. For example, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August, right? August, what Chinese government did? Chinese government just terminate any kinds of dialogue, on the climate change, and also Chinese government really, terminated all channels of communication with, the United States. Now, Yinhong. Now, going back to Professor Yinhong, do you think that Chinese government, would the Chinese government,
I have 3 points to argue in some degree and with Korean professors. The first is that I doubt that as a Chinese, and your point of view of China's economic future and in relation with the United States are little too optimistic. And you look at, and anything, especially in this era, are very dramatic and dynamic. In most recent years, China not only still keep its economy go down, the situation, but the revenue of the state the debt of all the Chinese national government, local government, and corporations are dramatically, the debt, the dramatically increase, and the revenue remarkably decrease. And also, I think that in the face of all of the old and new economic and technological difficulties, I don't think that the central government have a major new tool to deal with the situation. The second point I would argue against a little too optimistic situation of so-called emerging new Cold War. You compare with old Cold War between Soviet Union and United States, you see that the main competition field, Europe, especially since the Second Berlin crisis, are highly stabilized. And the structure was very simple, and even stupid people in Moscow and in Washington could deal with it. But look now, in East Asia, Western Pacific, and they are so dynamic, several hotspots, and any one of them could have a chance to block out. Not only Taiwan Strait, Peninsula, and especially compared with Taiwan Strait, between China and the United States, there are a lot of experience to stabilize the Taiwan situation to prevent the direct conflict between Washington and Beijing. But over Peninsula, there's almost no, direct, indirect, governmental or non-governmental the discussion of what's the scenario if it happen. They only talk about in the past and on the supposition that if North Korean regime collapses, then China will do something. But nothing else really discussed even, let alone policy plan. South China Sea is, relatively speaking, a most stable hotspot. And East China Sea situation are much more dangerous than those in Southeast Asia. And all of these dynamic and shifting hotspots, and also if you consider there is no any arms control dialogue, let alone negotiation between Washington and Beijing. If you consider that there is no recognized basic rule to deal with the rivalry between two great powers. If you look at these, and I don't think that you could have a lot of reason to be optimistic and of the planet situation and compare with the old Cold War. Lastly, I was very short.
Yeah.
I think that the great powers always have a priority to deal with different functional area problems. Great powers, especially now, Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo, and Moscow, and even in less degree, EU power capital, they not part climate change addressing. They not part some cooperation on global governance area for the priority. They all part on so-called national and international security on the top level. And so in the past years, so many people are repeated generally a liberal point of view to deal with the new situation. But why the new situation not only improved, but even deteriorated in some degree? We should take a more realistic approach to first to clarify vital interests, then to make some, although very difficult but still possible, trade-offs to respect each other's vital interests.
Okay, now let's turn to the issue of NATO. Okay, President Yoon attended the NATO summit in Madrid in late June, and also our government is planning to set up its representatives in Brussels and at the NATO headquarters. Professor Kim, what did you take on that kind of move?
예, 저는 일단
Well, the U.S., in order to check the Soviet Union, it reconciled with China so that China can move away from the Soviet Union. I think that was more efficient and cost-effective and efficient. And that was a strategy that the U.S. pursued back in the Kissinger days. And they had to decouple the Soviet Union and Russia back then. But the people in the U.S., if you look at the opinions of the people in the U.S., that was actually gone during the presidential election campaign. And instead, it ended up in coupling Russia and China. So the current method is to use or connect the network that you already have. So NATO, Korea, US, and Japan. If we link these two, for the China issue, you engage NATO, and for Russia, you engage Asia. That's the US strategy. So that is actually part of the big picture that the U.S. has to link NATO with Asia.
You have been arguing that there will be a Europeanization of NATO, okay? But now Professor Kim as well as Professor Yinhong have been arguing there is just the signals that the NATO will be stretching its reach into Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. What is your take on that one? I see the difference between Professor Kim and your view.
Are you asking me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. This is kind of paradoxical because of Trump's policy towards NATO, where there was a real threat that the United States would withdraw from NATO. NATO initiated studies of the threats from China. And this was mainly because they wanted to keep the United States committed to NATO by showing solidarity in some way with the US concern about China. So this has developed then in NATO into a China policy. But this is countered by the current developments with the war in Ukraine, which really forces NATO to concentrate completely on Russia. So I see a kind of rhetorical move in NATO towards Asia, trying to show the Americans that we are also interested in your concern. But on the other hand, the main real change is a full NATO concentration on Europe, with perhaps again a risk that the United States will not be committed, so that Europe has to replace the American role in Europe with armed forces and strategic policies of their own. This is a big challenge for the NATO countries in Europe and also for the EU.
Professor Yinhong, Professor Stein Tønnesson raised a very interesting idea. Kim Jong-un, Yoon Suk-yeol, and Biden should meet together, and they got to be trilateral summit sooner or later. Do you buy that argument? And is there any possibility?
I'm sorry that I do not buy these ideas because, and Kim Jong-il have had some summit with U.S. president during Trump years, and have a lot of summit, and with the Wen Zai-in, but summit is not so important. Summit is so often could become a part of strategy or even tactic. What is Kim Jong-il's fundamental objective? And I think that if you take this objective according to many years observation, and everyone could agree that to have a combative nuclear missile capability, and not necessarily an intercontinental capability. Intercontinental capability could become a bargaining chip in the best bargaining situation defined by Jingdong himself. But he will not, and he will not agree, and even publicly, even as a trick, and in any degree to the denuclearization of his regime.
Okay,
They
Professor.
only want arms race, arms control, and a negotiation with an ROK and the United States. But
Okay.
ROK and the United States even have best intention still insist on the useless final objective of denuclearizing on North Korea,
Okay.
which
Now-
and Pyongyang will never accept.
Okay, Professor Kim Joon-hyung, what is your take on the Yinhong's argument? Okay, it is impossible to have a trilateral summit. Okay, and the whole this denuclearization idea is totally useless idea. What is your take on that one?
저도 뭐
보시나요? Well, in realistically,
really feasible options either. 지금의 상황에서
well, considering the current situation, well, there are two different conflicts between U.S. and China, and between U.S. and North Korea, Russia. But I mean, so therefore, I mean, I don't think at the moment U.S. has not the willingness to deal with, I mean, North Korean issue or the issue on the Korean Peninsula as a top priority.
strategic patience.
Okay, Stein, what is your response to Professor Yinhong's pessimism, and also, Professor Kim Joon-hyung's guarded pessimism?
First, I must confess that I see no prospects in this trilateral summit happening anytime soon. But this is also because I don't think that this is the intention of either President Yoon or President Biden. They are simply not keen on this. Trump was a very special personality, and he wanted this man-to-man meeting in a kind of individualistic drive, and he pushed this through against his main advisors. But I think that Yinhong's arguments were underpinning the need for such summits, because I agree completely that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear arms totally, but North Korea behaved very well, in a way, relative to previous times during the period from 2018 until 2020, with no nuclear tests and no missile exercises. And there was also a halt in the combined exercises between South Korea and the United States. Now we are in a situation that is similar to 2017 again. With provocations from North Korea, and completely predictable, because when Kim Jong-un is isolated, he must draw attention to himself and show his nuclear power and his military power, and he's going to force us into new crisis situations, and there is nothing sensible that the United Nations or other countries can do to counter it with new sanctions, because North Korea has been sanctioning itself during the pandemic into an extreme isolation. So it's contact that is needed, and contact on the top is what could lead to new moratoriums on testing and calming the waters, preventing the kind of incidents that we are now going to see.
Okay, now with our stopped the discussion among panelists, now we have several questions from the floor as well as online. Okay, let me ask questions from online. Okay, now I was impressed by the presentation. I learned a lot, but I have the two sets of questions. One question is this: United States is now pursuing decoupling strategy, and U.S. has been putting pressure on South Korea to decouple, China in its supply chain networks. But South Korea is too dependent on China for international trade. Okay, now what kinds of supply chain strategy we should pursue in this kind of sandwich situation? That is one question, and maybe Professor Yinhong can answer to this question. And the second question is this: now, U.S.-China strategic competition is the deepening, and now Professor Kim and Professor Tønnesson suggest the possibility of South Korea taking the lead in setting up the new peace discourse, okay, to avoid the U.S.-China confrontation and conflict. What kinds of strategies can you give to us? Okay, now, Professor Yinhong, what kinds of advice would you give to South Korea?
Thanks for the question. I never see the U.S. demands and to itself or to its allies and partners of decoupling from China is out a close-range matter. And the Biden administration and before that, Trump administration only asked other countries to strictly regulate and almost to the degree of the exhibition of high tech and high semiconductor and high end chips to China. And I don't think that at present even South Korea have exported this kind of high tech and high end chip to China. And the United States, of course, want other countries, especially Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, to squeeze even a little more on chip export to China. But it's not, U.S. vital interest to still let them to export some, chips or semiconductor or technology below the level of the high technology, high-end chip defined by, for example, Commerce Department of the United States.
Thank you.
So there will be never all across decoupling. Decoupling is only touched on those which China desperately desired, but still for a relatively long time cannot produce for strategic and other high-end use.
Now, time is running out. Stein, how would you respond to this peace strategy and how the so-called mediating role of South Korea in U.S.-China confrontation and competition?
The two questions that you asked are related because one important task is to keep up economic integration and trade with China and investments in China against ideas of harming China through any kind of radical decoupling policy. But on the other hand, all countries should also recognize that there is a need to prevent the world from depending on the production of certain items in just one country. We've seen this now in Europe with the gas. The gas dependence on Russia is a big liability. So here we have a kind of proof to show that we must not depend on just one item. Therefore, it's also, I have sympathy for initiatives to prevent the dependence on rare earth from China by making sure that we can produce rare earth other places as well. So these kinds of itemized measures are legitimate and should not be seen as parts of a strategy to decouple, but simply as a strategy to ensure the flow of essential goods on the global market.
Thank you. Now, Professor Kim, let me just combine another question from the floor. India and Malaysia have shown very smart diplomacy. between U.S.-China confrontation and the Ukrainian situation. What is your take on what is your assessment of the diplomatic behavior of India and Malaysia, and what kinds of lessons can we learn from those two countries?
예, 이 두 나라뿐만
Yes, not just these two countries and including Indonesia. They are also not well, hearing what the U.S. says, and the same goes for, Saudi Arabia. They are following their own directions, and they are now enjoying some kind of, reflected interest. So, if you look at India, not just between U.S. and Russia struggle, India is one of the place in the world that can replace the roles played by China. In terms of the number of population, but so far it has not moved that much. If you look at I think ASEAN is the same. Free and open. That always comes in front of, when you talk about, ASEAN. And IPF, that also comes after free and open. So that clearly shows that the U.S. is afraid of being these, collaborations or coalitions being exclusive and isolated. So, okay. We have one more question from the floor. Who will be the winner of the Ukraine war? The war is still ongoing, so we don't know who will win. We don't have the winner yet. But, how the Ukrainian war will end, this was briefly touched upon by Dr. Tønnesson. I think this is a really interesting question. Okay.
From floor, why didn't U.S. intervene to mediate or prevent the Ukrainian war? It is very interesting to observe that neither United Nations nor United States played a role in preventing the war in Ukraine. Why was that one?
The United States tried to prevent it by telling the whole world secret intelligence about the movement of troops from Russia to the border. And that was a clear warning, both to Ukraine to prepare itself and for Russia to desist from its intention to invade. The rest of the world, including myself, did not believe the American warnings. I simply did not fancy that Putin would launch an invasion like that. So maybe there has been also among others who do not trust the US intelligence, but the US really did its best, I think, to try to deter it.
마산에 계신 우리 오길석 선생님 질문 있으세요?
Okay, so we have one question from Mr. Oh from Masan.
Question from the floor is addressed to Professor Stein Tønnesson. If you look at the case of the Korean War in 1950, even in Ukrainian war, I believe that there is some kinds of conspiracy on the part of a military-industrial complex. They want war so that they can dispose of all the weapons they produce, so that they can get the economic benefit. Do you buy that argument?
No.
Why?
No, I don't think the arms industry is at the table when you take those decisions. It's mostly either because you have a kind of revanchist or expansionist leader coming to power or being in power, or it's simply because of human errors in conflict management.
Professor Yinhong, the last question to you. Now, President Xi Jinping now elected third term. Is it good for world peace or bad for world peace? Is there any good chance that the President Xi Jinping has a grand bargaining with President Biden?
Oh, this is a very sensitive question, and to anyone in China, in China's political culture. I can only say that the 20-party Congress endorsed all the major elements in China's foreign policy in the past years. First, and most important elements in China's foreign policy in the future will continue to be first, strategic build-up. Second, extension of strategic activity of China. Third, prepare for war in the worst scenario against the United States and its co-allies, especially Japan. Fourth, do China's utmost efforts to prevent such a conflict. And you see, and these four elements, the first of three are in one direction, and the last, and not least important, is in another direction. And how to deal with and strike a balance among these elements is, of course, very challenging. And even more challenging is China's domestic basis. How to achieve China's protracted economic stability at home and to dramatically increase China's high-tech self-development and escalation. And these two domestic challenges, and combined with, of course, international environment, is most, testing. And the prospect, I personally believe, is still uncertain.
Stein, what is your take on that? What is your guess?
The concentration of power in one man, which I resent, also makes it very clear who you can negotiate with. So I must say that I have taken I have gained some little hope from seeing a basic difference between Putin and Xi Jinping, in that Putin has shown a willingness to take enormous risk, while I think that Xi Jinping has throughout his career been a rational, calculating game player or power player. So he can be counted on not to behave irrationally in the way that Putin has done with Ukraine.
Okay, Professor Kim Joon-hyung, what is your take on that?
예, 저는 지난 작년에
This is what came from the a secret meeting participated at Court Campbell. And after the third term of President Xi, because of the he will focus on domestic economic issues, and if it fails in 2-3 years or for 5 years, he will focus on conflict on the U.S. to consolidate the internal affairs of China. We talked quite a few things, and one thing for sure is that we have to prevent a new Cold War era, and in order to do so, the strategic confrontation between the U.S. and China should mitigate. And in terms of geopolitical confrontation between the two countries must be resolved. To this end, Korea and other countries will have to form an international solidarity to help these two countries get out of the confrontation through diplomatic efforts. I think the three discussants, the three people share the same that the security is very important, but security achieved through peaceful discourses is very important. And Professor Tønnesson came up with this East Asia theory. And I agree to East Asian economic theory of Professor Tønnesson. And after it in Asia and after the Vietnamese War, there was no war that wreaked havoc on the lives of the people in East Asia, and that is unique to Asia. And East Asia focused on developing economy instead of building security. So that is capitalist peace, and the second is democratic peace theory. And I think that is the path that the history have to take.
Commended him very highly, but you deserve that kind of commendation. 그래서 그런 점에서 본다.
In that sense, the direction that we have to take is surprisingly that the liberalist order that was made by the U.S. has been a bliss to us, and China is trying to break the liberalist order that was built by the U.S. and that's why we have to have global discourses to deter this. I believe the three professors had a good discussion, although we didn't have Professor Hankyoreh here, but he made a very meaningful contribution. We have to overcome the new Cold War and hegemonic struggle to build peace on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. That is our mandate. This brings us to the end of the session. And Professor Tønnesson is joining us at 4 a.m. in Oslo. So let's give him a big hand to him for helping with us. And another big hand to Professor Yinhong. I know he's a very busy person, and thank you for joining us at this early hour in the morning. A big hand to you.
And of course, to Professor Joon-hyung, he's been always a good friend to our symposium discussion. I mean, he is a really good expert to join us. Once again, please give him a big hand. Always welcome you and appreciate your insights. With this, we will wrap up the session one. Thank you all very much. Well, it was a really interesting session. Once again, please give a big hand to the keynote presenter and the discussants. Thank you for their insights. Okay, as already announced, with this we will wrap up the morning session, and we will now take a lunch break. At the registration desk, we have a lunch coupon ready for you, and a map to guide you to the venue. We will be back at 1:30. For session 2, please make sure that you're back to the conference hall by 1:20. I hope you enjoy your meal. Thank you.